Constantinople, May 29, 1453. The dawn breaks blood-red over the greatest city in the Christian world. Princess Theodora Palaiologina stands at her palace window, her silk gown trembling against her skin as the thunderous roar of Ottoman cannons shakes the ancient walls of her ancestors. Through the smoke and chaos, she can see them, thousands of Ottoman soldiers pouring through the breached walls like a dark tide of conquest. But Theodora isn't watching the fall of her empire. She's watching the approach of something far more terrifying than death itself, because she knows what awaits her. She knows what Sultan Mehmed II does to captured Byzantine princesses. And in this moment, as she hears her father Emperor Constantine VI's final battle cry echoing from the walls, she understands with crystalline clarity that the sword would have been mercy. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of conquest and defeat. This is the story of a fate so twisted, so deliberately cruel, that it redefined the very meaning of suffering. For the noble women of Byzantium, capture meant something worse than torture, worse than execution, worse than anything their worst nightmares could conjure. Today, we're going to uncover what really happened to the daughters of emperors, the wives of nobles, and the princesses of the Byzantine Empire when they fell into Ottoman hands. And I warn you, once you learn these truths, you'll understand why some fates truly are worse than death. The morning of May 29, 1453, began like any other in the imperial palace of Constantinople. But it would end with screams that echoed through the marble halls of a thousand-year dynasty. Princess Theodora Palaiologina, born to the purple as the Byzantines called their imperial offspring, had lived her entire life in the lap of divine luxury. She had been educated by the finest scholars, dressed in silks that cost more than most people's homes, and had never known a moment when she wasn't treated as barely below the angels themselves. But as Sultan Mehmed II's massive cannons, the great bombard that could launch a 600-pound stone ball over a mile, finally breached the Theodosian walls that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years, Theodora's world didn't just end. It inverted into its darkest possible reflection. The contrast was deliberate, calculated, and absolutely merciless. The Ottoman military machine wasn't just conquering territory, it was orchestrating psychological warfare on a scale that would have impressed modern propagandists. When the first Ottoman soldiers burst into the Great Palace, they didn't come as mindless destroyers. They came with lists. They came with specific instructions. They came looking for particular people. Princess Theodora's sister, Helena Palaiologina, was discovered hiding in the chapel of the Holy Apostles, clutching a golden crucifix that had belonged to her great-grandmother. The soldiers who found her didn't kill her. They didn't even strike her. Instead, they gently, almost respectfully, took the crucifix from her hands and informed her in broken Greek that she was expected at the Sultan's pavilion. The courtesy was more terrifying than violence would have been, because it revealed the depth of planning behind what was about to unfold. The imperial women were not random casualties of war. They were the centerpiece of a conquest strategy that had been planned for months, perhaps years. Sultan Mehmed II understood something that many conquerors miss. Destroying a civilization's symbols is one thing, but corrupting them, transforming them into their opposite, that's how you break a people's spirit permanently. As the day wore on and the full scope of the conquest became clear, the surviving members of the imperial family began to understand their fate. They weren't going to be executed alongside the men. They weren't going to be ransomed back to Christian Europe. They weren't even going to be held as honored prisoners of war. Something far more sophisticated and infinitely more cruel awaited them. That first night in Ottoman captivity, as Theodora and her female relatives were held in a commandeered Byzantine mansion under heavy guard, they could hear the sounds of celebration from the Ottoman camp. Victory feasts, music, the kind of revelry that typically follows a great military triumph. But they could also hear something else, the sound of construction. Hammering, sawing, the movement of heavy materials. The Ottomans were building something specifically for them. The terrible irony was that these women, who had lived their entire lives as some of the most privileged human beings on earth, were about to discover depths of degradation that peasant girls could never have imagined. Their very nobility, their exalted status, their divine right to rule, all of it was about to be turned into instruments of their own destruction. To understand the true horror of what awaited the Byzantine princesses, you need to understand that the Ottoman harem system wasn't just about collecting beautiful women for the Sultan's pleasure. It was a sophisticated institution of cultural genocide, designed to take the daughters of conquered peoples and transform them into willing participants in their own people's destruction. The Topkapi Palace harem contained over 400 rooms, but it wasn't a prison in any conventional sense. It was a gilded cage designed to make captivity feel like privilege. The walls were decorated with the finest Persian carpets, the floors were inlaid with precious stones, and every meal was served on golden plates. But beneath this luxury lay a system of psychological manipulation so refined that it could break the strongest will within months. When Princess Theodora arrived at the harem, she wasn't thrown into a dungeon. She was bathed in rosewater by skilled attendants, dressed in the finest Ottoman silks, and given quarters that were arguably more luxurious than her rooms in the Byzantine palace. But every single element of this treatment was designed to accomplish one goal: the complete erasure of Theodora Palaiologina and the creation of something entirely new in her place. The process began with the name. Theodora, gift of God, in Greek, a name that connected her to Byzantine empresses going back centuries, was immediately discarded. She would now be called Gulbahar, meaning spring rose in Turkish. It seems like a small thing, but names carry identity, history, connection to family and culture. By changing her name, the Ottomans began the process of killing who she had been. Next came the clothes. Byzantine imperial regalia wasn't just fashion. It was a visual representation of divine appointment, of a bloodline chosen by God to rule. The purple silk, the golden threads, the religious symbols woven into the fabric, all of it connected the wearer to 1,000 years of Christian empire. Ottoman dress was equally symbolic, but it represented submission to a different God, a different culture, a different understanding of the world itself. But the most insidious part of the harem system was how it used other captured women as agents of conversion. Theodora wasn't placed among Ottoman women who might treat her with the contempt due to a defeated enemy. Instead, she was surrounded by other former Christian princesses, daughters of Serbian despots, Bulgarian boyars, Albanian lords, all of whom had undergone the same transformation and now served as living examples of how resistance was not just futile, but foolish. These women didn't torture Theodora or threaten her. Instead, they befriended her, comforted her, shared stories of how much better their lives had become since accepting their new reality. They spoke of the honor of serving the Sultan, the privilege of bearing his children, the way their former lives seemed small and provincial compared to the cosmopolitan sophistication of Ottoman court life. The daily routine was designed to gradually replace Byzantine habits with Ottoman ones. Morning prayers were no longer Christian, but Islamic. Meals followed Islamic dietary laws. Social interactions were governed by Ottoman court etiquette. Even the language slowly shifted from Greek to Turkish, as Theodora found herself increasingly isolated when she insisted on speaking the tongue of her ancestors. Perhaps most cruelly, the harem system offered genuine rewards for compliance. Women who embraced their new identity could rise to positions of real power. They could become favorites of the Sultan, mothers of princes, wielders of political influence that would have been impossible in their former lives. The system didn't just punish resistance, it rewarded collaboration with privileges that made resistance seem not just difficult, but actually irrational. The Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother and the most powerful woman in the empire, was herself a former Christian slave, captured as a child and transformed through this same system. She served as the ultimate example of how complete the transformation could be. Here was a woman who had once been Christian, now serving as the mother figure to the man who was conquering Christian lands and converting Christian children. 3 months after the fall of Constantinople, Princess Theodora Palaiologina committed her first act of collaboration. She had been resisting the daily Islamic prayers, maintaining her Christian faith despite the constant pressure from other harem women and the Ottoman religious instructors assigned to her education. But on August 15, 1453, the feast of the Assumption of Mary in the Christian calendar, a day sacred to her family and her faith, Theodora knelt on a Persian carpet facing Mecca and recited the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. What broke her wasn't torture or threats of death, it was something far more sophisticated. The Ottomans had brought her a 7-year-old boy, dirty, frightened, speaking Greek with a Constantinople accent. They told her this child was her nephew, the son of her brother who had died defending the walls. They explained that the boy's fate depended entirely on her cooperation. If she converted to Islam, he would be raised in the palace as a privileged member of the Ottoman court. If she refused, he would be sold to slave traders bound for the markets of North Africa. The child wasn't actually her nephew. Ottoman intelligence networks had become sophisticated enough to identify random Byzantine children who could pass for imperial relatives, but Theodora had no way of knowing this. Faced with what she believed was a choice between her own spiritual integrity and a child's life, she made the choice that the Ottomans knew she would make. She submitted. But submission was only the beginning. The real horror of Theodora's situation became clear when Sultan Mehmed II summoned her to his private chambers, not as a conquered enemy or even as a concubine, but as his newest wife. The marriage ceremony was conducted according to Islamic law, with great pomp and celebration throughout the Ottoman court. Theodora, now called Gulbahar, was dressed in magnificent robes, covered in jewels worth more than the entire annual revenue of most European kingdoms, and presented to the world as a willing bride who had chosen love over loyalty to her defunct empire. The wedding night was perhaps the cruelest moment of all, because it completed Theodora's transformation from victim to collaborator in the eyes of both cultures. To the Ottomans, she was now proof that even Byzantine princesses recognized the superiority of Islamic civilization when given the choice. To the surviving Byzantines and the broader Christian world, she had become a traitor who had chosen comfort over faith, luxury over loyalty. But the true measure of Ottoman psychological sophistication became clear 9 months later when Theodora gave birth to a son. The child was immediately declared a potential heir to the Ottoman throne, meaning that Theodora had not just betrayed her own people, she had potentially given birth to their future conqueror. The boy would grow up speaking Turkish as his first language, worshipping Allah, and viewing the Byzantine Empire as a relic of ignorant superstition that his father had been wise to destroy. Other Byzantine noblewomen met similar fates, each carefully tailored to their specific circumstances. Princess Helena Palaiologina was married to a powerful Ottoman general, creating a symbol of Christian submission to Islamic authority. The Duchess of Naxos was given to a provincial governor, spreading the message of Ottoman dominance to the furthest reaches of the empire. Each marriage was a propaganda victory, a visible demonstration that the old order had not just been defeated, but had chosen to join its conquerors. The women who resisted met fates that were arguably worse. They weren't executed. That would have made them martyrs. Instead, they were gradually isolated, denied the privileges accorded to cooperative captives, and eventually forgotten. Some were sent to serve as domestic slaves in remote provinces, their imperial bloodlines becoming meaningless as they scrubbed floors and cooked meals for minor Ottoman officials. Others simply disappeared from the records entirely, their resistance noted and then carefully erased from official histories. The most heartbreaking aspect of these stories is how completely they achieved their intended purpose. Within a generation, the children of these forced marriages were indistinguishable from native Ottoman nobility. They spoke Turkish, practiced Islam, and served the empire that had conquered their mother's people. The cultural genocide was so complete that the victims' own children became unknowing agents of their continuation. Princess Theodora lived for another 37 years as Gulbahar Sultan, bearing 3 more children to Mehmed II and eventually becoming one of the most influential women in the Ottoman court. Contemporary accounts describe her as devoted to her husband, pious in her Islamic practice, and actively involved in the conquest and conversion of remaining Christian territories. Whether this represented genuine conversion or the ultimate victory of survival instinct over principle, we will never know. The Theodora who had trembled at her window watching the conquest of Constantinople was gone, replaced by someone or something entirely different. Perhaps the most diabolical aspect of the Ottoman treatment of captured Byzantine princesses was how it was framed as an act of unprecedented mercy and honor. This wasn't simply propaganda for external consumption, it was a carefully constructed narrative that made resistance psychologically almost impossible for the victims themselves. Sultan Mehmed II's court historians wrote extensively about the magnanimous treatment of the Byzantine imperial family. They contrasted Ottoman behavior with historical precedents. When Rome fell to barbarian tribes, the imperial family was slaughtered. When Christian crusaders conquered Muslim cities, they typically murdered every inhabitant regardless of rank or gender. But the Ottomans, these histories claimed, had elevated their former enemies to positions of honor and privilege unprecedented in the annals of conquest. This narrative wasn't entirely false, which made it so psychologically devastating. Theodora and the other captured women were living in luxury that most people could never imagine. They wore clothes worth small fortunes, ate delicacies imported from across the known world, and wielded political influence that would have been impossible in their former lives. From a purely material standpoint, they were better off as Ottoman wives than they had been as Byzantine princesses. The Ottomans made sure that news of this preferential treatment spread throughout the remaining Christian territories. Diplomatic messages were sent to European courts describing the honor accorded to the former Byzantine royalty. The message was clear: resistance was not just futile, but counterproductive. Submission to Ottoman rule meant elevation, not degradation. This propaganda was reinforced by the women themselves, who were required to write letters to their former allies describing their happiness in their new situations. These letters, some of which survive in Ottoman archives, are masterpieces of psychological manipulation disguised as personal correspondence. They describe gratitude for being rescued from the backward superstitions of Christianity, joy at discovering the true faith of Islam, and amazement at the enlightened governance of the Ottoman system. The children born from these unions became living embodiments of this narrative. They were raised with full knowledge of their maternal heritage, but taught to view it as something they had transcended rather than lost. Prince Bayezid, Theodora's eldest son, was educated in both Greek and Turkish, but learned to see Greek as the language of a defeated, obsolete civilization, while Turkish represented the future of human progress. The psychological impact on the women themselves was devastating precisely because the privileges were real. Theodora genuinely did have more political influence as Gulbahar Sultan than she ever could have wielded as a Byzantine princess. Her children genuinely were better positioned for worldly success as Ottoman princes than they would have been as Byzantine refugees. The system didn't just force compliance through fear, it made compliance seem like the rational, even the moral, choice. Perhaps most cruelly, the Ottoman system eventually convinced many of these women that they were the lucky ones. They were shown letters from Christian refugees describing poverty, persecution, and constant fear of further Ottoman expansion. They were told stories, some true, some fabricated, of Byzantine women who had escaped capture only to live in miserable exile, dependent on the charity of foreign courts that viewed them as expensive reminders of a failed civilization. The ultimate proof of the system's success came when these women began actively recruiting others. Gulbahar Sultan personally wrote letters to the wives and daughters of unconquered Christian nobles, describing the advantages of voluntary submission, and offering to sponsor their conversion and integration into Ottoman society. She had become not just a victim of cultural genocide, but one of its most effective agents. To understand why the Ottoman treatment of captured Byzantine princesses was truly worse than death, we need to compare it with the alternatives these women faced and recognize what they lost in choosing survival. Death, even violent death, would have preserved their identity, their honor, and their connection to their ancestors and faith. Throughout history, captured royalty who chose death over submission became martyrs, remembered and revered by their people. Their stories inspired resistance, their sacrifice validated their people's values, and their memory served as a rallying point for eventual liberation. But the Ottoman system eliminated even this possibility of meaningful resistance. By making submission materially advantageous and psychologically rationalized, it turned potential martyrs into collaborators, symbols of resistance into symbols of defeat. The captured princesses became living proof that their entire civilization had been based on illusions that crumbled when confronted with a superior alternative. The comparison with other conquest scenarios makes this clear. When Spanish conquistadors defeated Aztec nobility, they typically executed the men and enslaved the women, but they didn't systematically attempt to transform those women into willing agents of Spanish culture. When Mongol armies conquered cities, they might spare attractive women for their harems, but they didn't invest years in psychological conversion programs designed to make those women enthusiastic advocates for Mongol civilization. The Ottoman approach was uniquely sophisticated in its cruelty, because it recognized that destroying a person's body is far less effective than destroying their identity while leaving their body intact. A dead Byzantine princess was simply a casualty of war. A living Byzantine princess who had become an Ottoman sultan's wife and the mother of potential Ottoman heirs was a walking demonstration of the superiority of Islamic civilization and the inevitable destiny of Christian Europe. The horror was compounded by the fact that this transformation was largely irreversible. Even if rescue had been possible, which it wasn't, what would have been rescued? The Theodora who fell into Ottoman hands in 1453 ceased to exist within months of her capture. The woman who might theoretically have been liberated years later would have been Gulbahar Sultan, a devout Muslim, a loyal Ottoman subject, and the mother of Turkish-speaking children who would have been horrified by any suggestion that they abandon their father and their faith for the sake of a Byzantine heritage they had been taught to view as shameful. The story of what happened to the captured Byzantine princesses represents one of history's most successful campaigns of cultural genocide, so complete that even today, most people are entirely unaware of how it was accomplished. The Ottoman Empire's treatment of these women has been historically misrepresented as enlightened tolerance, when it was actually sophisticated psychological warfare. Princess Theodora Palaiologina and her fellow captives faced a choice between physical death and spiritual annihilation, between the preservation of their identity and the survival of their bodies. The fact that they chose survival doesn't make them weak or contemptible, it makes them human. But it also makes their fate a cautionary tale about the depths of cruelty that can be disguised as mercy. These women deserve to be remembered not as they became, but as they were, the last daughters of an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years, who faced circumstances so impossible that no choice available to them could preserve both their lives and their souls. Their stories remind us that there are indeed fates worse than death, and that the most effective forms of conquest don't just defeat a people's armies. They convince the people themselves that defeat was actually liberation. The next time you hear someone speak of the Ottoman Empire's tolerance and enlightenment, remember Princess Theodora watching from her window as her world ended, knowing that what awaited her was worse than the death her father would die on the walls. Remember that tolerance and enlightenment can be the most effective masks for the most sophisticated forms of cruelty. If this hidden history has shocked you, if these forgotten voices have moved you, then subscribe to Deep Historians. There are countless stories like this one, buried beneath centuries of propaganda and misrepresentation, waiting to be told. The victims of history deserve to have their true stories known, no matter how uncomfortable those truths might be. Because in the end, the greatest victory we can give to people like Princess Theodora is to remember who they really were, before the world convinced them to become someone else.